I'm going to record it. So thank you all. Thank you all for joining. This is a program on climate education and action, and our focus is understanding and communicating the science. This was intended to be a program in person at Congregation Har Hashem in Boulder, Colorado. Of course, you know, events have overtaken all of us, so here we are now gathered virtually on Zoom, which I think has allowed some people to come who would not otherwise have been able to be here, and other people who may have wanted to come in person, you know, with various events now happening, you know, aren't here, but those of us who are, I think will enjoy and learn from this program and appreciate kind of coming together. I want to thank just a number of people who helped make this happen. So first of all, a thank you to Har Hashem Social Action Committee, to our Green Team, to our Executive Director, to our Rabbi and Emerita Rabbi, who we'll hear from in a moment, all of whom have supported this program. Yonatan Malin and Steve Sanders helped organize the program. I want to thank our speakers who will be introduced in just a moment, but taking the time, you know, out of their days and in these difficult times to come and share with us. And thank you to all of you for coming together. It's not easy to focus on something other than the current health crisis, and yet, you know, there's potentially tremendous opportunities for us as a society to come out of this crisis in a way to, you know, work on other critical issues like climate. And we'll share more at the end that this is planned to be part of a series of programs this spring. I think we've all learned that just because you plan something doesn't mean it will happen. But at the moment, we do have other programs planned, and we'll share that at the end. So just a few things. We will keep people on mute until we get to the question period. But you know, during those times, please keep yourselves on mute unless you are asking a question. There's a chat function. So if you scroll to either the top or bottom of your screen, probably at the bottom, you should find a way to, if you have a question that you want to ask to the group or direct it to me, Diana Lane, then you know, we'll try to get your questions answered during the question and answer part. If you're comfortable turning on your video camera, it helps enhance our sense of community, but if you're not in a place where you want to do that, that's fine as well. I want to, so this is our agenda for the day. I'm offering up a welcome now. Rabbi Deborah Bronstein, our Emerita Rabbi at Har Hashem, will give us an invocation. Yonatan will introduce speakers. Kriti will be speaking to us about kind of understanding science and impacts of climate change. Professor Max Boykoff from CU will be talking to us about climate communication in creative ways. We'll then be breaking up into small groups. So that's a function that Zoom allows. So depending on how many of us total join, we'll have a few different groups, and each group will have a moderator. So we'll have 10 or 15 minutes to come together and have some discussion, and then we'll close with some resources for people. So again, thank you for joining this program. And this is an experiment. We haven't done this before. So please be patient as we, you know, kind of potentially fumble our way a bit through some of the technology and so forth. So Rabbi Bronstein, let me unmute you so you can talk.
I've done it already.
You've done it already. Wonderful. Okay.
Thank you. Well, it's very good to be together at this time, albeit virtually. And it's very good to think about something else that's critically important in our lives right now. I have to make an immediate apology that I'm going to be leaving a little early, so I'm glad that you're recording this. There are Jewish moral teachings that form us, shape us, in every area of life, including in how we relate to this amazing earth. Just like Shabbat does not end due to the coronavirus, our attention to these values concerning the environment cannot wait. Nor can we allow ourselves to become paralyzed due to the immensity of the tasks that lie ahead. We're about to hear some heavy-duty stuff today. Let's not forget that hopefulness and vigor have led us to this moment. We cannot take on the climate crisis without vision and a sense of community, even though we're physically separated right now. Recently, I heard a poem called An Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones, and I'd like to share it with you as a way of starting us off. Together, we will create brave space because there is no such thing as safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. This space will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. Thank you.
And for people who want to see the poem, thank you so much, Rabbi Bronstein. We have it there. Yonatan, do you want to go next and introduce our speakers?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So this program came out in part out of discussions that we had at an original planning meeting, and it was particularly Steve Sanders, who's a member of Har Hashem with me, and I who kind of thought this would be important as a starting point for the series of programs. And we felt that there were two things that were really important. One is to understand the science. What is climate change? What causes it? And what are some of the impacts? So we want to make sure that we know what we're talking about. But along with that, we really felt that it's important to begin to find effective ways to talk about climate change in ways that lead, I think as Rabbi Bronstein referred to, that lead to engagement and hope and not to despair or burnout. So we wanted to know, what does the social science say about the best ways to create sustained positive engagement? And I just want to say one of the things that I've been inspired by is some ideas from Katharine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist in Texas. And she says that the three most important things you can do when it comes to climate change are, number one, talk about it. Number two, join an organization that amplifies your voice. And number three, advocate for system-wide change. So that's why I thought the communication piece was so important to what we're doing as well. So I'll now introduce our first speaker. And Kriti is a climate scientist who works for the Environmental Defense Fund. At the Environmental Defense Fund, she is part of a climate team that is helping to accelerate rural poverty alleviation, strengthen adaptation to the effects of climate change, and promote climate mitigation in Asia. Kriti is also a Zen teacher, activist, and dancer, and she is co-founder of the Boulder Eco-Dharma Sangha. Kriti will speak to us now about the science and impacts of climate change. So maybe, Diana, if you want to unshare your screen so she can share hers.
Yes. Yep. I mean, oh, and you're unmuted. Okay, good, wonderful.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was a beautiful poem, Rabbi. Thank you for sharing that. It is my honor and pleasure to be here. I have a few flu symptoms right now, and it is so important to be talking about this. I so agree with what Jonathan said. All of us, even if we think we know the climate science, we are harboring, in my experience, a lot of myths. About causes, relative importance of different causes, and extent of impacts that we are currently facing versus what we can face in near future and long-term future. So I will just get started. If there are any questions in the chat box, sometimes there are quick clarifying questions, please don't hesitate to bring them up, Diana and Jonathan, because sometimes they help all of us better. So I like to always point out that there are 3 thin layers of water, soil, and atmosphere that make all life possible on the planet. We are going to focus on atmosphere, but all of these layers are related to each other. Health of these layers is related to each other. All of the fresh water that we can use is this little dot here, 50 to 100 miles in diameter. That's all the fresh water we have. It's only when we add ocean water, which is salty water, that we end up having a sphere of this size. And at any given point, anyone who's a gardener knows that there is 2 to 8 inches of topsoil. Atmosphere, which is the thin layer where all of our oxygen is, or all of our accumulating carbon dioxide is only 20 miles. That's half the distance between Boulder and Denver Airport, right? It's such a thin layer. If Earth were an apple, the atmosphere is 1/3 of apple skin. So you see, it's a very thin layer where greenhouse gases are accumulating. Now, what is greenhouse gas effect, which is causing global warming or climate crisis? I like to say that's like putting blankets on Earth. So the thickness of atmosphere doesn't change, but we are accumulating blankets over Earth so that whatever sunlight and heat is coming in, the heat element stays within the atmosphere. The more we are burning fossil fuels, the more we are cutting our forests, the more we are releasing nitrous oxide from growing food, all of those different kind of layers are adding on, piling on top of each other. And some of them disintegrate in the atmosphere sooner, and some of them stay in the atmosphere for a long time. Different blankets are stable to different extents, okay? This next slide is one of the most important slides I can show you. This on the vertical axis is concentration of one of the main greenhouse gases, one of the main blankets on planet Earth. And on the horizontal axis, time 0 is where we are today. And then we go down back in history 800,000 years ago. Okay, and you will see for all of this period between 800,000 years ago and now, carbon dioxide concentration has been between 180 and 280 parts per million, right? Human beings have never seen the extent of carbon dioxide we have on planet right now, which is over 400 parts per million. You can see that red circle on the top right. Human beings evolved somewhere around 150,000 years ago, right? The Earth has not fully seen the steady state impacts of this amount of carbon dioxide. And that is because most of the heat is going into the oceans. So let me explain what you are seeing on the screen right now. These extra layers of blankets that are being added is equal, it's adding heat in the atmosphere at the rate of 4 atomic bombs per second. That's the net amount of heat accumulated. It's humongous. It's really humongous, right? So since year 2000, we've accumulated 3 billion Hiroshima bombs worth of heat in our Earth as a system. And most of that heat is, 90% of that heat is going into the ocean. The land and atmosphere are only absorbing small part of it or experiencing small part of it. So one of the direct impacts of this accumulated heat is, of course, temperatures are rising all over the earth. There is drought, there are fires. And the indirect result is that our weather overall is on steroids. We have more powerful storms and more powerful wildfires, typhoons. One crucial thing to notice here, and any climate scientist will tell you the importance of this, is all weather events, any amount of flooding, hurricanes, storms, are impacted by climate change. There is no doubt about it. But it is wrong to say that climate crisis is the only cause of any event, right? The climate crisis is adding fuel to the fire. Literally, quite literally, in many cases. It's making, if you were a sports person, you can imagine that, you know, if you are taking steroids, not every goal you do is because of steroids, but it's adding energy and power. It's like the air molecules, if you can see my face on the screen, it's like the molecules used to go like this, and because of heat, they are going like this. Another good thing to get on same page about is, what is this 1.5 or 2 degree goal that people keep talking about in climate agreements or in news? Island nations across the world have been saying we need to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius change. What does that really mean? Here's a second important graph. Climate scientists like to compare Earth's current global average temperature. So if you were to take Earth's temperature on land all across the world and average it throughout the year, that is the temperature we are talking about here. We are not talking about maximum or minimum temperatures. It's the entire planet's land whole year average temperature. And then we take the temperature, which was the average temperature between 1750 and 1900, and take that as your baseline, and then compare the current temperature with that baseline. So the temperatures in 1900 or 1750, right, here are our baseline. And now in 2020, we are here. We have already warmed up Earth's average temperature by 1 degree Celsius, right? And it looks like a small change, but it is global average. And then we have these different pathways with and without policy, which I will get into later, okay? So I hope the concept of what is 1.5 degrees Celsius change or 2 degrees Celsius change that Paris Agreement was talking about makes sense. As I pointed out earlier, climate crisis isn't caused by just one kind of blanket. We have multiple greenhouse gases and multiple causes. So a large pie here is because of burning of fossil fuels. Then there is another large pie which also releases carbon dioxide gas, but it comes from cutting down our forests. Then there is carbon dioxide coming from chemical industry. There is a very large pie coming because of CH4, which is methane, right? So the livestock emissions, production of meat causes a lot of this methane production. And then there's nitrous oxide, which is the gas which is produced when we put excess fertilizers to grow our food. Okay. Now, where does greenhouse gas come from in terms of emissions? Once again, some of us like to focus on electricity sector, food and land use, cutting down of forests. That's 1/4 of the pie. Transportation sector, industry, heating our buildings, and so on. And it is so important to see here that food and land use is such a big part of the pie. This distribution right now does not include the energy that we spend in processing food. These are direct emissions. By the time we add processing energy that it takes to process the food, to produce fertilizers, to produce pesticides, this pie goes up to 35 or 40% of the total emissions. So our food has large impact on our personal footprint. This is another very important graph, which is showing us the cumulative global emissions. And so starting about here, we are seeing what are the historical emissions. This is where we are right now in 2020. For a 1.5 degree sea change, which is what island nations say they need, without which they will literally drown, we need to make enormous, near impossible changes, near impossible. And to make a case for how impossible those changes are, anyone who has the answer to this question can unmute themselves. I'm going to ask everyone who knows to tell me what is an average American's carbon footprint. Does anyone know how much one individual is responsible for emitting if we were to just take an average number? You can answer in kilograms, tons, or pounds. Anyone want to take a guess? Okay, I'll tell you. Then an average American is emitting 65,000 pounds of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. That's an average number. And you know what it needs to be if we were to have justice on the planet? If you were to just average emissions all over the world and say this is your fair share of emissions that you can have and still avoid mass catastrophe. That number needs to be 5,000 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. That's the enormous responsibility that we have, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later. So when you look at that amount of challenge and some people begin to say, is this too late? Are we doomed? The changes that are required are so much, maybe we'll never make it. So this is a complicated slide, but I will distill it down to one main message. In our climate system, there are many, many tipping points. So let's pick up example of Arctic sea ice. In this visual, you can see it says in small letters, Arctic sea ice tipped. By tipped, it means that no matter what we do today, even if we were the best stewards of planet Earth at this time and everyone decreased their emissions, There is no way we can protect Arctic sea ice from completely going away in next 5 to 10 years. It is going to be gone. That system has tipped. However, there are many other critical ecosystem functions, planetary level functions, including circulation of the ocean, how weather systems are controlled all over the world because of presence of Amazon rainforest or different kinds of ice sheets. There are many other systems that are crucial and are still stable. So what I like to say is that we have crossed some tipping points and we might cross a few others, but there is still a lot more that we can protect and fight for. If only we can manage our own internal response and communicate well about it, right? I could break it down further if there was time, but the main message is this: is it too late? Don't allow anyone to say it's too late. We have crossed some tipping points. Mother Earth's lungs and heart are hurting, but there are many other tipping points. And we must create islands of sanity to deal with this issue. Very quickly, this is a well in India. Most of people trying to gather water are women. This has become a common sight. When there is no water, there is food scarcity. Needless to say, people who are at the bottom of the racial and caste system get impacted the most. In India, this is also happening very often, that people are caste shamed, race shamed, excluded from resources. Syrian drought was in part, not exclusively, in part fueled by years of drought. People of global majority, by which I mean people who are not of European descent, Black, brown, indigenous, yellow, pink people, yellow people, they have caused in general least harm. They will suffer the most. They have teachings that we need for these times to face chaos. When I was in New York and Sandy hurricane hit us, I called my mom and aunts to figure out how to survive for 2 weeks without electricity. A lot of resilience is there in cultures who have faced trauma before. And bodies, religion, and culture of people all over the world have been subjugated to create financial wealth in the West. And it might feel like too much for some people, but I believe that racism is a cultural cause of climate change. And when it comes to solution, people who are people of global majority are often a side dish, including in mainstream environmental organizations that sometimes I myself represent. Just showing you images, few more images of ecosystems and people and butterflies that are impacted by climate crisis. On the bottom left is an image of pteropod. It's a sea butterfly whose skin, their shell is dissolving because of increasing acidity of the oceans, which is happening because of climate change. I think this image speaks for itself. Birds are vanishing from America, not exclusively again because of climate change, but in part. And insects are going away, and in general, our ways of being are responsible for 1 million plant and animal species on the verge of extinction. This is my last 2 slides. We often talk about who's responsible for climate change, and some of us like to say US is the problem, but some of us, I have heard, say Well, China and India are the problem. And if you look at this slide, it's giving you two things. One is the solid bar, which is emissions, let's say, of China, around 7,000 million metric tons of carbon dioxide in 2010. And this is where we expect China's emissions to be in 2030. And India is number 4 right now, but it's slated to become number 2, even cross United States by 2040. So you look at something like this and you say, this is Asian problem. They are polluting. I have 2 objections to that statement. Number 1, before I talk about those 2 problems, I wanted to talk about food systems. If food waste were a country, going back to importance of the agriculture sector, food waste would be number 3 on this list. As a country, this is the amount of food we waste as a civilization. The emissions embedded in food waste are enormous. And if we were to take total food system, that's the first country globally. Now to my 2 objections to the statement that China and India and other developing countries are the problem. These are cumulative emissions. So you can see, since the beginning of Industrial Revolution, all the regions of the world are marked here. And you can see the historical emissions by United States in teal here. And this is European Union in yellow at the bottom. And China or India are thin slivers here, you see? So even if the emissions per year right now are high for India and China, if you add it up across decades, you can see my point. And this is number 2 point, which I was referring to earlier. Per person emissions in United States, Canada, are the highest, among the highest in the world. And India and China are way at the bottom. Okay, India and China are where we collectively need to be for climate sanity. We have a huge amount of responsibility, globally speaking, here. As much as we struggle with things in our lives, our collective responsibility continues to be an issue. Now, here is the issue with which I will end, really my last point. The scale of the problem is really huge, okay? Going back to what you were saying, Jonathan, about systemic issues. The scale of the problem is a 60 billion ton problem, right? 1 ton is 1,000 kilograms, so 2,200 pounds. So the scale of the problem is really large. And you can say, how does it matter if my individual emission is 65,000 pounds or 5,000 pounds? I'm not controlling anything, right? Or I'm controlling very little. The question is it's both a science problem and a cultural problem and a spiritual problem. How do we get together as a community in ways that we can take a bite at a 60 billion ton problem? Which means we don't just change our bulbs. How do we make a system where that all the bulbs all over the world have a certain price? Or how do we create these community level villages where everyone's footprint comes down? We have to share a lot more. We can become a guru or rishi or ascetic up in the mountains, living like a hermit, to come down from 65,000 pounds a year to 5,000 pounds a year. We will kill ourselves in the process, but we will not change the system. So the connection between personal and systemic is very important. Otherwise, we feel like we can't change the system, so I'm paralyzed. My doing anything doesn't change anything, so I am paralyzed. the community, importance of community is huge here. And that's why I'm excited that your community is taking the leap into looking at these questions, because none of us can deal with this alone. I can let this go. I was just going to talk about in the big picture. This is not wearing any organization's hat. I'm not representing any organization in saying it. My firm belief is that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We need to add it in the ground. We need to put carbon in the soil, and we need to limit transport, let go of our meat industry, so cruel in many ways, local soils and communal village life. I have extended talks on scientific matters on YouTube and our website, and happy to take any questions now or later. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kriti. That was really wonderful presentation. So anyone who wants to ask a question, if you kind of take your mouse down to the bottom of your screen, you'll have an option to unmute yourself, and you can ask a question there. If you want to put it into the chat box, I can also ask your question for you. And I also just want to say, and we'll say this more at the end, our next program is about food systems because of the very large impact. So we will be getting there next. So thank you again. We understand if you need to drop off after your presentation, and we hope that you, if you do become more sick, that you recover very, very quickly and fully. Thank you again. Any questions that people have?
I wanted to ask, this is Diane. So first of all, thank you. That was, I'm an environmental consultant, and I think I know some of this, and then you look at it and go, mush, so much to learn, so much to do. Are the slides or the presentation proprietary, or is the way we can get them? I tried to take notes and it was so full of information that I only got part of it.
You know, this is for if all of my slides are on my website, and there is a much longer presentation that breaks down each issue in detail on YouTube. So if you look under my name, you will find it. Just use it. If you can cite me, that will be great. But if it helps the work, go ahead and do it.
We're there's several of us actually that are part of an environmental group, Simon and JJ and Bill and us. And so it's really for us to be able to add more to the programs we're trying to do for a community here in Lakewood. So we won't, I mean, I wouldn't use them for anything except to try and be a little smarter. But thank you.
Definitely. And if you have any questions, email anytime. This is my heart's work. So.
Yeah, I can feel that. Thank you very much. Thank you. And be well. Thank you.
Kriti?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, our carbon footprint is almost zero right now. So do you have last week's numbers? Because there's a big dip in everything, right? This is the best thing you can do for carbon footprint is a pandemic.
It's not zero right now. We are still emitting food-related emissions that are going on.
That's about it.
Getting our computers running, our cloud space running.
Oh, yeah.
There's
lots more.
Yeah. I do want to say that what is the changes that are happening in emissions and pollution levels all over the world, will dolphins returning to the lakes, and
the dolphins can swim in clean water now because the ships aren't going. It's nice.
Yes. And unless we are totally organized and we have frameworks for shifting our economy, we will go right back. China has gone back and has relaxed environmental standards like crazy, right? So you are right, Lynn, nature has the ability to bounce back. That is beautiful to see. And this is not the right way to do it. It can become eco-fascist very quickly. and we need to be vigilant so disaster capitalism doesn't
I wonder what happened on the curves in 1918.
we didn't have that much emissions at the time of
Oh,
Spanish
right.
flu. Our emissions were way lower.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, we also, really feel for there are people in tremendous economic distress right now. And so we need a just transition. Steve, I think you can unmute yourself if you go to the bottom of your screen, because I see you raising your hand. There you are.
Hello, Kati. Thanks very much for asking. Sorry about my video. Just here. Can you hear me?
Steve, it's hard for me to hear you. Can
Okay.
others hear, Steve?
No.
Not very well.
Kind of
Let me try
muffled.
working on that for a moment. Maybe take a different question and I'll work on that for a moment.
Okay. There's a question in the chat about, is home gardening helpful, or is it really taking too much water from our city system?
I have never done that calculation of how much energy it takes to bring water to our homes. I think you should do gardening.
Yeah,
Just
that's an intuitive yes. Garden in your house.
but
Let me go to Steve. If your sound is, and I think that might be our last question on this presentation right now, so we can move to our next one. But if you have more questions, particularly for Kriti, and you put them in the chat, we can send them to her also by email, and she may be able to respond. Later we could let people know. But again, so Steve, if you want to ask a last question.
Steve, it's still not working. Are you able to put your question in the chat box?
Like you can text it.
There is a question about food waste. I'll say 2 lines about it. It's very difficult to centralize management of food waste. I believe you will address it in your next session on food system. So food waste is something in developing countries like India, where I come from. Food waste happens between farmers' plot, farmers' field, and going to market. We don't have cold storage. So we need to protect food waste from happening there. And in developed countries, in US, in Europe, it happens from between grocery stores and our homes and our tables. So each of us communities have to take way more responsibility of reducing food waste. On the slide, I don't know if I should be taking more questions, Diana, you should guide me.
Yeah, maybe if you want to reply to it in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, Steve, that's a very good and big question, but I think we want to move on. So, we'll allow Kriti to reply a little bit in the chat if you don't mind staying on for a few moments to do that. So we're next, were you going to introduce Professor Boykoff? Okay.
Yes, I would love to. And I'm going to share my screen at the same time because I will be sharing his slides. So let me set that up right now and get that going. So our second speaker, Max Boykoff, is Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Science and Technology at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's author of a book that has a wonderful title. It's called Creative Climate Communications, and it was just published last year in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. He's really involved in 2 research projects at CU. The Media and Climate Change Observatory monitors media on climate change. And the second one is called Inside the Greenhouse, which is a laboratory for creative climate communications. So Professor Max Boykoff will speak to us now about climate change communication.
Thank you very much. Can folks hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Rabbi Bronstein, for hosting this conversation. Really appreciate the comments that Dr. Kriti had just shared, and that helps me perhaps take a few next steps before we have breakout conversations here. I think it is, you know, pretty straightforward to say now that climate change is one of the most prominent and existential challenges of the 21st century. I've said that many times before. The circumstances have changed dramatically in recent weeks with COVID-19. Nonetheless, we continue to face this collective action problem. It's a consequence of our shared behaviors that cut to the heart of how we live, how we work, how we play, how we relax and interact with one another in today's world. And so with it, there are many deep-seated paradoxes that make it a topic that exposes frivolity and failings of the human race, but then also some cruel paradoxes that Dr. Kriti had started to allude to in some ways. That, for instance, there is a paradox that many people that are at the forefront of climate impacts are rarely those who have contributed much to climate change through their own activities and what some call their carbon footprints. Another paradox actually can be that as more scientific understanding improves, rather than settling all the questions that we have, it actually they can unearth new and more questions that we need to then answer. And so climate change really becomes this defining symbol of our collective relationship with the environment. I think that with the developments that we've been seeing over the last weeks and months with the coronavirus, we recognize now the interconnectedness of our planet, of us as humans at the human environment interface with other living beings in this world. And we recognize how our individual choices have global consequences, both in the immediate and over the long term. So one of the challenges that we're facing with climate change is that we have a great deal of scientific understanding that Dr. Kriti had pointed out into the causes and consequences. But largely speaking, the way in which we're able to talk about and engage with others on this issue in a highly polarized and partisan environment, particularly here in the United States, leaves us very much stuck. These barriers have blocked off needed pathways to engage and to take action, to have important conversations. What we have instead is what's called often climate silence or an engagement gap. So this partisanship, this politicization, and this polarization has very much gotten in the way of what are needed productive conversations about this collective action set of challenges. Jonathan, if you could advance to the next slide, I thought that I would just put in here some very practical takeaways. And Professor Katharine Hayhoe, who is a colleague and even friend who you spoke about in the very beginning of this session, has some important things to say. And the first thing that you pointed out is that we need to talk about climate change. There's research that's done at Yale University and George Mason University that has found that we have more or less been silent about these issues. Only 9% of a representative sample of our US population talk about climate change with friends and family often. So what we're having here in this conversation is a rarity. There's only 40% of the general public in the United States that talk about it even occasionally. So one of the most basic things that we can do is to talk about climate change as we walk away from this session together. We can talk about some of the science that Dr. Kriti had pointed out to us. We can listen to others' perspectives. We can have those important conversations that need to take place within context, that need to take place within context of coronavirus, within context of just transitions, as Diana had pointed out. So these are the basics to engagement and action. If you could please just advance to the next slide. You know, I'm here today because I have written this book that Jonathan had talked about. And what I've tried to do is to build upon what are seen to be dominant scientific ways of knowing and learning. So Jonathan, if you could advance this, we can see unfolding before us many scientific reports that have provided for us information that help us better understand the changing climate and our role in it, as well as some of the consequences that are associated with it. Climate change, one of the important takeaways that I want to share with you is that it is not a single issue. This is a threat multiplier. It's an intersectional set of challenges that weaves its way through considerations of public health, as you can see in some of these reports, with food considerations, which I'm glad you'll be taking up in your next session, with, say, foreign policy, as this is a global challenge, with poverty, with justice, with immigration and migration challenges as well. Science has been this dominant way of knowing. Jonathan, if you would advance just to put up, there's a couple of quotes, if you could put up this one and the one that follows, that science has helped us better understand through information what is the state of affairs. And Brian Wynn has talked about this in terms of this information deficit model. It is very important, and oftentimes scientists are relying on that information to help guide conversations towards engagement and action. But as Suzanne Mosier below points out, providing this information and filling knowledge gaps is at best necessary, but rarely is it sufficient to create the kind of active behavioral engagement that's needed. And so while we rely on these scientific reports, if we threw a stack of scientific reports in front of one of our loved ones, in front of our neighbors, in front of our friends, it only gets us part of the way there. So what a book that I've written is to try to expand out these ways of considering, of knowing and learning about climate change into the experiential ways of knowing, into the aesthetic ways of knowing through the arts, into visceral ways of knowing, into emotional ways of knowing, and so forth. If you could then move forward. Expanded pathways we see all around us. If you could just put up in succession a number of the ways in which we've seen this through social movements, that there have been a number of protests that have been taking place. And these are a few of the signs that I think I particularly like that help us enlarge these considerations of the ways in which we engage and we learn about a changing climate. If you continue along, Jonathan, we've seen the People's Climate March. We've seen a March for Science. And even more recently, we have seen youth climate strikes that are taking place, which really gained a lot of momentum in the past calendar year. So what we can say here safely is that this is a way for us to build upon the sciences and for us to understand that everyday people, including elected officials, including important decision makers, typically don't wake up in the morning or engage regularly with what is peer-reviewed scientific literature. Whether it's through a United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report or the most recent findings from an influential journal like Science or Nature or The Lancet. But instead, we are shaped by these everyday interactions, where these are shaped by social movements, by things that we observe, by media that we consume, and these then make up those expanded spaces. If you could advance to the next slide then. I want to give you a few examples just to be concrete about how this can play out in policy, of how we can be creative about the ways in which we talk about a changing climate. You know, when I get to the book title, I have climate in parentheses, and I'll elaborate on that just by saying that the way in which I've written this book, I hope that these provide creative communications for a variety of topics, including science policy topics. But also, a reason that it's in parentheses is that we need to consider that creative and ultimately effective communications about climate change sometimes may involve not invoking the terms climate or climate change explicitly. Now, this is not to say at all that we ought to shy away from confronting a changing climate, but we can more effectively bridge conversations and overcome defenses by perhaps talking about issues that are connected like resilience, like stewardship, like what kinds of legacies we'd like to leave on this planet, like religious perspectives such as Judaism and other religious perspectives, and so forth and so on. This first example I provide for you is just one that helps make this concrete. There are examples all around us, but this one in particular, if you see in the bottom part of that front page, readying for climate change while calling it anything but, the online version of this was the following: that conservative states seek billions to brace for a disaster, just don't call it climate change. This essentially is something that has unfolded over the last month, where the U.S. Department of the Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, has been doling out funding for disaster relief, $16 billion to coastal states to help them cope with climate-related disasters. And so in a set of proposals that's been put forward, Texas, for instance, that those who are seeking these funds in Texas are avoiding using the term climate change or global warming, and instead are talking about it through changing coastal conditions. In South Carolina, also trying to access these funds, talk about it rather than climate change, which may put up barriers. They talk about destabilizing effects and unpredictability of being hit by major storms. So this is a way in which these groups and these government agencies in a policy context are being smarter and more creative about the ways in which the way they discuss it has material effects in terms of HUD funding. If you could advance to the second example, here's an example that also has come up in the last weeks, really, where the U.S. Department of Agriculture has put forward a goal to cut farming's environmental footprint. Dr. Critty had talked about land use and land cover change making up a significant portion of these challenges around a changing climate. And so these targets are part of a department-wide, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, sustainability initiative set up by Secretary Sonny Perdue. But the initiative has been avoiding using climate change explicitly. Instead, it has been focused on research, on innovation, and improving the USDA's ability to collect data on farmers' conservation practices in order to meet food, fiber, fuel, feed demands of the future. This is another example of how certain agencies are creatively addressing these intersectional challenges, but through issues where it will have resonance with, say, the American Farm Bureau, that is largely supporting this more creative and more effective pathway forward, where Farm Bureau President Zippy Duvall and also lobbyists from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association have then expressed their support for these kinds of efforts. If you can advance then to the next slide, I just want to, as I introduce to you that notion of creative communications about climate change, I want to share with you an example that Jonathan had mentioned, that I'm involved in a number of projects at the University of Colorado Boulder. One is called Inside the Greenhouse. This is a project that is in collaboration with a theater professor. Her name is Beth Osnes, who some of you may know, and a communications professor who's Phaedra Pizzulo, as well as an ecology and evolutionary biology professor, Rebecca Safran. A very interdisciplinary group of us are seeking to build out and experiment in these ways of learning and ways of knowing with our students, and you can see pictures of them here. I just want to provide this as another example of these experiential, of these visceral, emotional ways that can inform and fortify scientific ways of knowing about climate change, not displacing them, but helping strengthen them in our everyday conversations. And so we've been doing this through comedy. Now, this may seem a bit odd, maybe to some of you at first glance, that this runs the risk of potentially trivializing critically important issues, that this may be like oil and water, taking something that is very sober and challenging and adding some levity to it. But we've actually been experimenting with this through humor as a generally underutilized way to connect people, to connect information, ideas, in new ways of thinking and acting. If you could advance the slide then, Jonathan, maybe one more time, and I think a bunch of examples will pick up here. In the United States context, you can see that, that there are many others in this arena that have been drawing on the power of comedy. And so we've used this to exploit cracks in arguments, to wiggle into, to poke prod, to make a nuisance of, to draw attention to the incongruities, the hypocrisies, the falsehoods, the contradictions that we live by in our everyday lives. That it has been a brand of comedy, actually, if you advance to the next slide, that we're calling good-natured comedy. Incidentally, the top left was a show that we had planned for the next weeks. We've since had to modify, just like everyone else. We're going to be having a show that's going to be entirely online. We're actually going to be getting some comedians from around the country to also participate along with our students and have 50 minutes of climate comedy on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. So stay tuned for that. But if you advance it just a little bit, we've been doing research on this idea of good-natured comedy. There are many different flavors of comedy. There is satire, certainly, that is very resonant. But the idea of good-natured comedy is for us to understand that we're all in this set of predicaments and challenges together. We've partnered with a group called Project Drawdown. Dr. Kriti, I saw that you had used a figure from some of their work. They do fantastic work. And they have provided 100 solutions, ways to address a changing climate. So what we've put in front of our students has been to have them put forward a comedic piece, whether it's a skit or a stand-up comedy, and then connect it up to one of these solutions at multiple scales, not just reduced to the individual. And we have found that through this work that comedy is enhancing awareness, learning, and knowledge. One's way of feeling as though they can effectively shape these conversations and these engagements. I could certainly say a whole lot more, but I want to make sure that I limit my time here. I just want to say, though, as I move from this example, that we found that a lot of power can flow through comedy. There is a strong political economy here that ought not be overlooked when focused in on cultural dimensions, societal dimensions, political economy, and path dependence of carbon-based industry and society. That this power that can flow through comedy can enable movements of authorized voices, that one need not be a trained climate scientist to have a voice, to have a perspective that is worth sharing and worth listening to. That this can be opening up complementary ways of knowing and new routes to engaging with a changing climate. And Jonathan had mentioned also at the very beginning, which is resonant for me, I've written a fair bit about in the book, about how we can overcome a lot of the doom and gloom by offering these new routes that pair increased awareness with opportunities for engagement. And so we found that through this, through the power of comedy and climate change together. So while we ought not kid ourselves that this could be sites of mere distraction, that what we've worked on through this project is to create these sites of enhanced engagement. And with other ways of approaching these issues, we found them to be opportunities to overcome polarization and even just simple climate silence. If you could then move forward. In the book, you could put all these up at once, perhaps. There are 10. I've walked through, the core of this book has been ways in which we can draw on, that's great there, we can draw on lessons that we've learned from social sciences and humanities scholarship to better understand how to effectively communicate about climate change in the 21st century. No longer are we just guessing here. We have had a great deal of research that's been produced over the last decade for sure and more that helps point to ways in which we can have more effective discussions. And so the tenets of that are on the left, being authentic about the way in which one is engaging. Say, for instance, Katharine Hayhoe, who's been mentioned before, who can speak very effectively and authentically to evangelical Christian communities. I am of the Jewish faith, and I can speak authentically through Judaism and Tikkun Olam to speak to, through my religious views, to certain groups like these and others. Also thinking about being aware of one's audience, being accurate, as Dr. Critty has helped us better equip ourselves with those scientific tools to be accurate, but then also to be imaginative and bold are important tenets here as we try and move forward. And then as you move to the purple on the right-hand side, it's important to draw on lessons from social sciences and humanities to understand that, yes, we can, there is a time and place for everything, but in order to make the kind of progress that's needed, we need to be working to find common ground. We also need to be discussing these issues, not as some distant threat in a place where we may never visit in our lives, but talking about it here and now in our communities with those who are at the forefront of climate impacts. And there are many benefits of engagement in terms of everything from strengthening community to addressing localized air pollution, public health, and so forth. And to create these spaces to creatively empower people is to increase our opportunities to then engage and take more substantive action that meets the scale of these challenges. And so there was this, 20th century view that if we just could dumb it down for the audiences, that everybody do the right thing. What we actually are learning through social sciences and humanities is that we need to be smartening up. We need to think very carefully. We need to be drawing on the lessons from social sciences and humanities to, in a disciplined way, smarten up how we very carefully address these challenges with a range of audiences. If you could advance to the next slide, I just want to provide for you one brief example of being authentic and being creative. And this is about, throughout the book, I tell many stories about building reliance, about relationships of trust. This is one example that I've provided about how Coal River Mountain Watch in West Virginia had actually adopted a slogan that was kind of funny called Save the Endangered Hillbilly. They partnered with United Mine Workers and fellow members of their communities to authentically push for safer working conditions and to stem and ban mountaintop removal and other environmentally damaging practices that were negatively impacting their air, their water, their public health in these communities. And so working authentically with West Virginians themselves and in nearby states, this Save the Endangered Hillbilly campaign was very successful in moving forward in these ways. If you could then move to the next slide then, Jonathan, thank you. So I mentioned Inside the Greenhouse, and I mentioned the wonderful colleagues that I've been working with. And the other one that Jonathan had mentioned in the introduction is this Media and Climate Change Observatory. We actually track 120 news organizations across television, radio, and newspapers in 56 countries around the world, actually 10 languages now. And this is a way for us to put our finger on the proverbial pulse of where are the conversations that are taking place around climate change. And not only that, but also where are there silences, talking about, for instance, questions of justice that are important. If you could advance the slide just to wrap up then, as I can see that time is not on our side. If you could put up these final comments, you can put them all up at once, that this particular book tries to help us better understand what's working, where it's working, under what conditions, with what audiences, and provides a handbook and a guide. I know that many people are busy in their lives, and so this is something that I've tried to contribute to help us find more efficient pathways into those meaningful conversations. And in so doing, pointing out that there is not going to be a silver bullet. There is not going to be a blank storm event that is going to dramatically change the challenges we have before us. There isn't going to be that dramatic report that is going to change it, but we need to be working on multiple fronts. So if you could advance the slide to finish up, things aren't what they used to be. This is again to lean on what Dr. Kriti has pointed out, that on the left-hand side, temperatures are rising. If you're younger than 35 years old, you've never experienced a month of lower than average of surface temperatures on this planet. And then on the right, you can see that the global ocean heat content has also been going up dramatically over the last decades. If you could advance the slide, this is my last statement, is that at present, the scale of our collective responses is nowhere near commensurate with the scale of these intersectional challenges. What I hope is that the contributions that Dr. Kriti, that myself, that many of you are putting forward is going to help us better address those challenges. But again, these are collective action challenges. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much and welcome any additional questions that folks may have for either of us or conversations that we want to move to.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has all been so wonderful and rich, and we were worried in putting this together that we were trying to pack in too much, and I think that is proving to be the case. And we really promised people some time to break into smaller groups for discussion. So I think we may move pretty quickly to that, and I'll explain how that works. But in the meantime, if people have questions for Professor Boykoff, if they want to put that in the chat, that might be the best way to get through questions. So I'm sorry we're running out of time for that, but thank you again to both of our speakers for such wonderful content. So let me share back to my screen for a second so I can explain what happens next. If you haven't done that yet. Okay. So in a moment, Zoom will invite you to join what's called a breakout group. And if you click to accept, you'll then be in a smaller group of kind of 6 or 7 people who will have about, at this point, about 10 minutes for discussion. So if you can very, very quickly introduce yourselves, and then we have a few potential discussion questions. And maybe we might really focus on the first one because of where we're at. You know, how has this current situation that we're in changed how you feel or talk about climate change? You know, we also have some questions about, you know, who might you talk to about climate change? How would you talk in ways, you know, as Professor Boykoff said, that are authentic, you know, creative, hopeful. So we will go to that. We will hope that it works. It's kind of an experiment. Again, thank you to our speakers. At the end of about 10 minutes, you'll be invited back to the main group, and we have a few resources at the end and information about our future programs. So hold on, it just sometimes takes a second, and we'll give this a try. So thank you all. So we just have a few last things to share. I hope that, I know that our discussion group was too short, but I hope you had at least a few moments to connect. So just in the couple minutes that we have left, a lot of questions I think came up about, what do you do beyond turning off your light bulbs and, your own personal actions? How do we try to create this system level change? So we're, trying to give people more resources. So our next session is about food choices, our food systems, and kind of the collective impact of that. So, please join us again. This is what we've planned, if people are healthy and so on. So we hope these will all go forward. We have a session planned with a panel who represent a wide different number of groups, both engaged in direct action and in advocacy, that we hope people will be interested in, and a program in June on some more resources, more at the kind of personal community level. There's also a Boulder Jewish tree planting campaign that's getting going, and you'll probably see more information about that if you're connected to the Jewish communities. Harshem has more details on these and some of our other social action programs. Again, a few more resources for people. And the Jewish responses to climate change, there's a new group called Dayenu. If you go there and you sign up, they're launching in spring 2020. Hazon has wonderful resources, Jewish Climate Action Network and Jewish Earth Alliance. There's a really nice handbook called Talking Climate at climateoutreach.org. 350.org has information right now that I think they're really thinking about connections between the pandemic and climate action. So that's useful. Citizens Climate Lobby continues to engage in national, pushing toward national legislation that would put a price on carbon and support vulnerable communities. The Boulder.Earth Climate Action Portal is a wonderful local resource for all kinds of information that's going on, including kind of really important engagement efforts at the community level. Let me see if there's anything. Oh, there's some things, if people are looking in the chat, Stop the Money Pipeline is an important one, Project Drawdown, the climate mobilization, the Boulder, Colorado.gov, there's a CMAP program going on, which is a really important action opportunity for people. We've reached 5:30, so we wanted to respect everyone's time. Again, thank our speakers and everyone who came so much. It isn't easy to think about another crisis when we're in the middle of this pandemic, but we all, I think, just really realize collectively that, we need to see how we can kind of take on and succeed at overcoming, these massive interconnected global challenges that we continue to be in. We wish everyone a refuah shlema, a complete and whole healing of body, of soul, as Rabbi Bronstein would always say, and strength to all in the days to come. So thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you, Diane, for organizing this.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks.
Diane and Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was excellent.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Steve, for being a really important motivator to why this whole program happened first. And Jan, thank you for your support on this. All of you for coming. Really appreciate it. Good to make our little communities happen in these different ways. So
Thank you again,
all.
Diana.
Sharing,
Thank you very
sharing.
much.
Keep well.
take care.
Keep
Bye-bye.
well, everyone. Stay safe.
Be well.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you so much, Max. Really wonderful content.
Thank you for bringing us together. Appreciate it.
Eliza, good to see you. Nice meeting you, new people who we haven't met before. Thank you, Dorothy. All right, and I think I will end the meeting. Maybe I'll just double check the chat.
I think the chat comes through in the recording.
Oh, does it? Okay.
I'm not sure it does, but you can stop the recording.
Right.